The sun rose over the Nile like molten gold. Its reflection shimmered across the city of Alexandria, the last jewel of the ancient world, where marble met sand, and the whispers of gods still echoed through temple walls. Ships from every corner of the Mediterranean crowded its harbors, bringing spices, silk, and secrets. And within its gleaming palace lived the woman who would soon shake the world. Her name was Cleopatra Philopator, last queen of Egypt, daughter of the Ptolemies, heir to a dying dynasty. She was barely 21, yet she carried herself with the poise of a goddess. Her beauty was not the beauty of statues. It was alive, sharpened by wit, power, and purpose. She spoke 9 languages, read philosophy, studied astronomy, and ruled with both charm and cruelty. Egypt called her the living Isis. But beneath the gold and incense, her throne was unstable. Her brother, Ptolemy XIII, ruled beside her, manipulated by greedy courtiers who whispered that Cleopatra was too ambitious, too dangerous, too Roman in her mind. Soon, she was exiled from her own palace, forced to flee across the desert with only a handful of loyal followers. From the west came news that Rome itself was divided. The great general Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, had crossed the Rubicon. The Roman Republic was dying, and in its chaos lay opportunity. Cleopatra understood something her brother did not. Rome's shadow stretched across the world, and only Rome could decide who sat on Egypt's throne. So she waited, watching, listening, until fate delivered her moment. In 48 BC, Caesar arrived in Alexandria, pursuing his rival Pompey the Great, who had sought refuge in Egypt. But when Caesar stepped ashore, he was greeted not by honor, but by horror. Pompey was dead, murdered by Ptolemy's men as a gift to win Caesar's favor. They thought Caesar would be pleased. They were wrong. Caesar looked upon Pompey's severed head and turned away in disgust. He had come as a soldier, but in that moment he became a judge. Rome would not reward betrayal, not even against its enemies. He ordered both Ptolemy and Cleopatra to appear before him to settle Egypt's royal dispute. Ptolemy obeyed, expecting Caesar's support. Cleopatra, still in hiding, understood she had one chance to reclaim her throne and her future. As night fell, she slipped through the city in silence, veiled and disguised. Guided by loyal servants, she reached the palace gates unseen. And when morning came, a servant unrolled a rug before Caesar's feet, and from its folds stepped Cleopatra, radiant, fearless, and smiling. In that single moment, history changed. The Queen of the Nile had met the man who ruled the world. When the rug unfurled before Julius Caesar, it was not gold or treasure that spilled out. It was destiny. Cleopatra stood before him, unafraid, unbowed, and radiant beneath the torchlight. Her arrival was an act of audacity that stunned even Rome's greatest general. In one gesture, she had turned her exile into theater, her vulnerability into power. Caesar had seen kings and conquerors tremble before him. But this young queen from the east looked him directly in the eyes and smiled. She spoke not as a supplicant, but as an equal. Egypt, she said softly, needs a ruler, not a boy with greedy priests whispering in his ear. Her voice carried both intelligence and charm, and her words struck deeper than any weapon could. In that moment, Caesar understood something. This was not a woman to be dismissed. This was a queen who had studied men like him, men of ambition, men who wanted the world to remember their names. And she knew how to become unforgettable. That night they spoke for hours. About Rome, about Egypt, about the nature of power. Cleopatra understood that if she could win Caesar's trust, she could win her throne. And if she could win his heart, she might win history itself. By morning, their alliance was sealed, not in parchment, but in promise. Outside the palace, Alexandria burned. Ptolemy's soldiers, enraged by Caesar's decision to support Cleopatra's claim, laid siege to the royal quarter. The Nile glowed red with fire and blood as Roman soldiers fought in the streets of a foreign city. Caesar, now trapped in the palace with Cleopatra, directed the defense himself. The queen watched as he moved through the chaos, calm, commanding, fearless. He was unlike any Roman she had ever known, and to him she was unlike any woman he had ever met. Between the sounds of war, their conversations continued. They spoke of philosophy, empire, and destiny. Two rulers bound not by romance, but by understanding. He admired her intellect. She admired his will. Together they were dangerous. When the fighting ended, the Nile was quiet again, and Ptolemy XIII was dead, drowned in his own flight. The war was over. Cleopatra was queen once more. Her image soon carved again into temple walls, this time beside the Eagle of Rome. Months later, Alexandria shone brighter than ever. Cleopatra ruled with Caesar's support, her enemies silenced. The two often dined together beneath the marble ceilings of the palace, surrounded by the scent of myrrh and lotus. Outside, the people cheered their queen, unaware that history was being rewritten beneath the flicker of candlelight. Cleopatra presented Caesar with a gift, her newborn son, Caesarion, Little Caesar. To her, it was proof that their union had created more than an alliance. To Rome, it was proof of her power. Rumors spread across the Mediterranean that Cleopatra had bewitched Caesar, that she planned to make Egypt the new heart of empire. In the Senate, men whispered that she was not a queen, but a serpent coiled around Caesar's neck. But Caesar didn't care. He saw in Cleopatra what Rome had long forgotten: vision. While others fought over politics, they dreamed of legacy. Together, they stood on the balcony of her palace as the sun set over the Nile, its reflection turning the river to gold. Rome, he said, was built by men who took risks, and yet they call me reckless. Cleopatra smiled faintly. Then perhaps, she whispered, it is time the world was ruled by both. The sound of the Nile faded behind him. When Julius Caesar left Egypt, he left behind more than a queen. He left behind a legacy. Cleopatra stood on the marble balcony of her palace as his ships disappeared over the horizon. In her arms, she held their son, Caesarion, the child she believed would one day unite two worlds, Egypt and Rome. But as the sails vanished into the haze, she understood what every ruler eventually learns. Power shared is power at risk. For a time, peace returned to Egypt. Cleopatra ruled wisely, her image once again carved into the walls of temples as the living goddess Isis reborn. Yet across the sea, in the heart of Rome, Caesar's name grew too large even for the republic that had made him. He returned from his wars in triumph. Gold from Gaul, ships from Egypt, slaves from every corner of the world. Rome had never seen such glory. The people hailed him as a god. The Senate feared him as a king. And in the whispers of Rome's marble corridors, Cleopatra's name echoed too. They called her the Queen of the East. They said she had bewitched Caesar, that she had wrapped him in silks and honey and turned him against his own city. Every gift she sent, gold, scrolls, even her portrait, only deepened their suspicion. For the senators of Rome, the union of a Roman general and an Egyptian queen was not love, it was heresy. Still, Caesar dreamed of her. He ordered a statue of Cleopatra to be placed in the Temple of Venus, his ancestor's shrine. It was an act of worship, but to the Senate it was blasphemy. When Cleopatra visited Rome in 46 BC, the city erupted. Crowds gathered to see the woman whose beauty had captured their dictator. She arrived not as a guest, but as a queen veiled in gold, followed by musicians and priests. And though she smiled, she could feel the daggers in every glance. Caesar dined with her in public, ignored the Senate's disgust, and spoke openly of their son, Caesar. Some say he planned to make the child his heir. If true, it would have meant the end of the Republic, and the birth of an empire ruled by East and West together. But Rome was not ready for that. On the Ides of March 44 BC, the Senate struck. The same men who had once cheered his victories drew their blades beneath the marble dome. As the daggers fell, so did Rome's last hope for peace. When the news reached Alexandria, Cleopatra locked herself in her chambers. She had lost not only her lover, but her shield. The Queen of Egypt was alone again. And somewhere in the shadows of Rome, new powers began to rise. Men who would come to finish what Caesar had begun. 2 years after Caesar's death, the Nile ran quietly again, but Egypt's queen did not rest. Cleopatra had survived assassins, exile, and the fall of her greatest ally. Now she ruled alone, a widow to ambition, but still the most powerful woman in the ancient world. And Rome, once again, was tearing itself apart. The men who had murdered Caesar, Brutus, and Cassius were hunted down by his successors. The Republic was gone. What remained was a contest for control. 3 men now ruled the Roman world: Octavian, Lepidus, and Mark Antony. Fate, it seemed, was not done with Cleopatra. When Antony summoned her to Tarsus, she did not come as a subject. She came as a queen. The story of her entrance would echo through centuries. Down the river came a golden barge, its purple sails billowing in the breeze. Silver oars dipped into the water in rhythm to the sound of flutes and harps. On a throne of gold sat Cleopatra, dressed as the goddess Isis, surrounded by attendants fanning peacock feathers. The air was thick with perfume, the scent of myrrh and lotus trailing across the water. Antony stood on the riverbank, stunned. He had seen empires bow and armies break, but he had never seen beauty used as a weapon of war. And Cleopatra, watching him from her throne, smiled. She knew she had already won. That night, their meeting became legend. Antony found in her what Caesar once had: brilliance, wit, and danger. She found in him what Rome had taken from her: a man who could dream. Together they forged an alliance, part love, part strategy. He would protect Egypt. She would give him the wealth to rule the Roman East. But between whispered words and shared wine, alliance became obsession. They feasted, they laughed, they built palaces for pleasure and politics alike. They called themselves the new Isis and Dionysus. In Alexandria's halls, they lived as gods, while in Rome whispers grew louder. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, saw it all as betrayal. He painted Antony as a traitor, a Roman corrupted by a foreign queen. He showed the Senate Antony's gifts to Cleopatra: gold, provinces, even the title of Queen of Kings. To Roman ears, it was blasphemy. And when Antony married Cleopatra in defiance of Roman law, the stage was set for the final war. Octavian moved swiftly, declaring war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra, making her the enemy of Rome itself. It was clever, brutal propaganda. By the time Antony realized what had happened, Rome's legions were already marching. The year was 31 BC. Their armies met at Actium, on the western coast of Greece. Antony's fleet glittered with Egyptian gold and crimson sails. Cleopatra commanded from her royal barge. But Octavian's admiral Agrippa was patient, cutting supply lines, tightening the trap. When the wind shifted, Cleopatra saw the battle turning. Her ships, heavy and ornate, could not maneuver against Rome's disciplined navy. Smoke filled the air. Flames devoured the sea. In the chaos, she turned her flagship and fled. Antony, seeing her sails retreating, abandoned the battle to follow. The army, leaderless and broken, collapsed. By nightfall, the sea of Actium burned red and gold, the color of glory turned to ruin. In the months that followed, their empire crumbled. They returned to Alexandria, surrounded by silence and defeat. Rome's banners closed in from every direction. Antony, once the conqueror of the East, now wandered the palace halls like a ghost of the man he once was. And Cleopatra, ever composed, ever radiant, began to prepare for the only victory left to her, the victory of memory. The palace of Alexandria had never been so quiet. Its marble halls, once filled with laughter, music, and feasts, now echoed only with the footsteps of defeat. Outside the walls, the banners of Rome fluttered in the desert wind. Octavian's legions had arrived. The dream was over. Inside her chambers, Cleopatra stood before a tall bronze mirror. The woman who stared back was no longer the girl who once unrolled herself before Caesar. Her eyes were sharper, her smile quieter, her grace touched by tragedy. She had ruled, loved, and lost everything, except her pride. In the next room, Mark Antony lay dying. When the Roman fleet closed in, he had drawn his sword against his own heart, but fate denied him even that mercy. Bleeding and delirious, he was carried to Cleopatra's tower. When she saw him, she fell to her knees. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Antony, his voice weak but steady, whispered, "I found glory, but I lost myself in your eyes." Cleopatra wept. She ordered her servants to lift him, to carry him to the window overlooking the Nile, the river that had witnessed their love and their fall. As the light faded, Antony's final breath escaped with a faint smile. "Do not bow to Rome," he said. "Let them call us traitors, but never slaves." And then he was gone. When Octavian entered the city, he expected chaos. Instead, he found silence, the kind only grief can create. He sent word that Cleopatra was to be taken alive, for he wished to parade her in chains through the streets of Rome, a living trophy of victory. But Cleopatra had lived her life as a goddess. She would not die as a captive. For 3 days she prepared. She bathed in milk and oils, dressed herself in gold-threaded robes, and wore her crown one last time. She dined calmly with her servants, her laughter soft and deliberate, like the sound of wind through papyrus reeds. Then, on the 4th night, she dismissed them all save 2. In her hand, she held a small woven basket filled with figs. Beneath them, hidden, was her weapon, an asp, the sacred serpent of Egypt. She lifted it gently, unafraid. To her, the serpent was not death, it was freedom. She pressed it to her skin, felt the sting, and whispered to the gods, "I will not bow." When Octavian entered her chamber the next morning, he found the Queen of Egypt seated upon her throne. Her robes shimmered in the morning light, her crown still upon her head. At her feet, 2 servants lay lifeless, their faces peaceful. A faint smile touched her lips, and a thin trickle of blood traced her arm, the mark of the SP. She had chosen her end, as she had chosen her life on her own terms. With her death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Egypt, once the heart of ancient civilization, became another province of Rome. Octavian returned to his city as Augustus, the first emperor, and the age of kings and queens gave way to the age of emperors. Yet even in victory, Rome could not escape her shadow. Artists painted her image, poets sang her name, and for centuries, the world spoke not of the conqueror, but of the conquered. Caesar built an empire. Antony fought for honor. But Cleopatra, she conquered eternity. As the sun sank into the Nile, the water glowed crimson and gold, carrying her legend downstream, the queen who defied Rome, and in death became immortal.